had for students, and I had 4 of them at the time myself, was to not really despair about a thing called Watergate. Because the whole concept of our constitutional liberties and freedoms as envisaged by the Founding Fathers worked during Watergate as I think that they contemplated that it would. To begin with, first and foremost, the First Amendment worked. There was no cover-up by the press with respect to this rather dramatic event. Going back to those days, I don't think that Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, felt under any inhibition with respect to the reporting and the investigative reporting with respect to Watergate. I don't think Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, who was chairman of the Ervin Committee, felt any restraint or inhibition in fulfilling his part of the whole problem and the whole story on behalf of the Congress, and particularly the Senate of the United States. Another aspect of this, however, is one that I don't think that we remind ourselves of. When our Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, they were very mindful of the tyranny of King George. That's why we had the First Amendment, that's why we had the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. But I think that they contemplated that from time to time the possibility would always exist that a President of the United States would abuse the power of his office. And being mindful of that possibility, they gave the people of this country the remedy of impeachment through their elected representatives. President Nixon was not impeached by the House. He was going to be. He had not been convicted by the Senate, but he was going to be, and that is why he resigned. There will always be abuse of power so long as men and women have it. There have been abuse of power in the White House in the past. It isn't a question of whether or not there's going to be an abuse of power. It's whether or not we have confidence in our basic institutions of government and freedom and liberty in this country, and faith in the fact that our Constitution is ultimately going to be a safeguard from the complete, absolute abuse and corruption of power. So as we have this discourse this evening and we try to resolve in our own minds what the effects of Watergate have been through these past 15 years, I'm using my few minutes of introductory remarks to direct your attention to what really happened and what the trespass was and what the assault was upon our institutions of freedom in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Father Robert Dreinen. He is well known to many in the Boston area. He attended Boston College, graduating with his BA degree in 1942, whereupon he entered the Society of Jesus and was ordained a Jesuit priest in 1953. He went on to get his master's degree, a law degree from Georgetown University, and then to return to Boston College as a professor and dean for 14 years. But in 1970, he decided to run for elective politics, ran and won election to the United States House of Representatives, and for the following 10 years served as a member of Congress in the 4th District of Massachusetts and as a member of the House Committee on the Judiciary. As a member of that committee, he was one of those who participated in the impeachment hearings that were held during the spring and summer of 1974. In 1981, he left the House of Representatives to resume his academic career. Since January of 1981, he has been a professor of constitutional law at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. It's with a great deal of pleasure that we have our next panelist, Father Robert Dreinen.
Thank you, Professor Porter. Before we get down to a few minutes of serious stuff, let me tell you about a little pleasantry enunciated recently by Congressman Mo Udall. He's one of my heroes and the heroes of millions of people. And Congressman Mo Udall said that when he dies, he wants to be buried in Chicago so that he can remain politically active. We were shocked and chagrined in the Congress at the obstruction of justice and the terrible things that have happened to the government. And as a result, the Congress in 1973 embarked in a long series of post-Watergate reforms. And as a member of the House Judiciary Committee and also the Committee on Government Operations, I was instrumental in writing some of those laws. Let me just tell you about three of them and mentioning several others. One of the most visible reforms is the initiation of a special prosecutor or independent counsel. This means simply that when Congress suspects wrongdoing in the Justice Department, it can inform the Attorney General that such and such person is under suspicion, and the Attorney General has 30 or 60 days to reply yes or no. And if he decides that yes, there is suspicion here, he must go to a designated court of judges, and that judge will appoint a special prosecutor. That special prosecutor or independent counsel law was sustained recently by the U.S. Supreme Court 7-1. Some people were surprised that the decision was so overwhelming. Along with this was established in the Justice Department an Office of Public Integrity, and that individual and his aides check out on everything that the Justice Department is involved in. Simultaneously, in every major agency, there is now a general counsel or an ombudsman or an inspector general. And I saw those laws go through, and the Congress, frankly, was relentless. Once again, the Congress said, we have to stand up and tell the people that this thing can never happen again. And that I can't express to you how shocked and amazed that everybody was, especially in the Congress, that this had gone on and somehow there was no machinery to check it. A second thing that Congress did, and of enormous importance, was the establishment of the Federal Election Commission, because, as you may remember, one of the essence of the corruption in Watergate was the fact that that CREEP, or the Committee to Re-elect the President, at that time had all types of unregulated money from various sources. And the Federal Election Commission said that no fund may be given now to a presidential candidate without being recorded. And the matching funds came, and that I think that the elections for the presidency in 76 and 80 and 84 and 88 have been remarkably well done, at least compared to the terrible election in 1972 with its corruption. The House and the Senate wanted to enact similar legislation for the election of congresspeople, and the Senate did in fact pass a bill comparable to the presidential with matching funds, and the House failed on the Anderson-Udall bill by only 12 votes, and that the PACs, now the Political Action Committees, I think are a scandal, and I have the hope that the next Congress is going to do something about that. A third major reform was the enactment of the Freedom of Information Act over the veto of President Ford. This means that any document in the Congress, with certain exceptions, or within the executive branch, must be revealed to those who petition. I think that this FOIA is probably more broad and sweeping than any law in any democracy in the world, and that was passed, again, overwhelmingly over the veto of Mr. Ford, and I was amazed that day that only some 40 or 50 people out of 435 voted to sustain it, and that sustain the veto. And it is an enormously important law that, in a certain sense, has changed the whole country. What are some of the other things that were done? They now have House and Senate committees on intelligence, so that the President must report every contemplated covert activity. He does not need permission for it, but he has to report it to these individuals. There were other things that were done. For example, every high-level official in the country must now reveal his income from extra sources, and that the judges have been brought into that for the first time. So you have now, for the first time in American history, revelations required of all these high-ranking people, along with their spouses. That you also have, as I mentioned, an inspector general in every agency, and that you have, I think, a post-Watergate morality, which I like to think has enhanced and improved the government. Some people are beginning to say, well, let's reevaluate all of that post-Watergate morality, and I'm not opposed to that. We do not have accurate empirical data on what this really has done. One last point, does this all inhibit people from going into government? We were very conscious of that in enacting these laws, and just this year, the Administrative Conference had a long day, two-day panel on this, and that there's some evidence that, yes, people don't want their privacy invaded. The result of Watergate was that the White House and all the agencies violated the integrity of government, and that, yes, now the privacy to some extent of future people is invaded. One last point that happened is this, that 28 attorneys were involved in Watergate, and the legal profession was ashamed that some of the major architects and the major defenders of the cover-up were in fact lawyers, and as a result the American Bar Association required a course on legal ethics beginning in 1975, and I like to think, as a legal educator who teaches legal ethics, that that's one of the very highly desirable spin-offs of Watergate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist, Fred Thompson, grew up and earned his undergraduate degree in Tennessee at Memphis State. Went on to get his law degree at Vanderbilt University School of Law, and then very shortly thereafter became Assistant United States Attorney for the Middle District of Tennessee. But at a very young age, he was plucked out of Tennessee to come to Washington as the minority counsel for the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, the Watergate Committee. And there he directed a minority staff of approximately 35 who represented the Republican membership on the Watergate Committee. He returned to the practice of law, serving as a special counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee, but took time out to publish a book on his experiences entitled, At That Point in Time, An Inside Story of the Workings of the Watergate Committee. Some of you may recognize him. He is come across your television sets and in your movie theaters recently. He has a second profession now, in addition to an active practice of law, and it stemmed from his crusading spirit as an attorney. You may recall some years ago that the chairman of the Pardon and Parole Board in Tennessee was dismissed by Governor Ray Blanton. Fred Thompson defended her, got her reinstated. This led to the subsequent indictment and conviction of the governor, his legal counsel, and other officials. This was the subject of a book and a movie starring Sissy Spacek entitled Marie, A True Story, and Fred Thompson played himself in the movie. This led to other movies, Unholy Matrimony, No Way Out with Kevin Costner and Gene Hackman, and earlier this month, 3 consecutive episodes of Wise Guy. A terrific attorney, a budding actor, Fred Thompson.
They told me there was a chance this would be made into a movie. It's the only reason I'm here. A couple of comments on the effects of Watergate. I think in one respect, the effects are less than some of us thought at the time. In another respect, they may have been more than some of you realize, considering your tender years, most of you. Less because back during that time, you could not believe how consumed the nation was. You could not believe how consumed Washington, D.C. was. People were watching it live during the day. They were going home at night and watching it on television, the reruns. Everywhere you would go, cab drivers everywhere in the country, they were talking about it. You had the ultimate melodrama playing out right before your very eyes with top political figures in the nation. Foreign visitors would come and visit the hearing rooms, and on more than one occasion ask various ones of us, will your nation fall? We explained to them our system and how we would survive, and we did survive. And I think in looking back on it, it does verify the things that Dick Kleindienst pointed out, that the system does work, did work. And I think it also leads us to believe that perhaps, we're stronger than we think, that things that happen not only in our personal lives, but in the political process in our country, that sometimes the significance of things are not readily apparent at the time, and it has become, to many of us, I think, a footnote in history as far as the details of the event is concerned. I think, secondly, and on the other hand, that it may in fact have a greater effect in our lives than what many of us realize. Father Dreinen pointed that out in terms of legislation that has been passed. I think it's very significant in terms of the separation of powers. I think it's probably more significant in terms of the swinging of the pendulum of power between the executive and legislative branches in this country than in anything else. I think after World War II, the executive was in the ascendancy. We had books written about the imperial presidency, but that has changed. It's changed in large part because of the blunderings of the executive itself. Because we had Watergate, certain actions during the Vietnam crisis. We've had Iran-gate. And those actions have led not only to legislation, as has been pointed out, some of which I think is very questionable legislation, but it's also led to a weakened executive, I believe, weakened in terms of, for example, most recently, during the Iran-Contra controversy. I don't think there was one instance where executive privilege was claimed by the White House for documents that the legislative branch wanted. I think almost unheard of. That's been a privilege claimed by presidents ever since they have been presidents. But because of the political weakness of the position, of the situation, self-inflicted in large part, they felt that they couldn't do that. I think the executive felt that it could not veto, for example, the Ethics in Government Act, which gave us the special prosecutor. Here you have institutionalized by Congress an individual whose job it is to investigate the legislative branch. I'm willing to argue the proposition that that may not be wise legislation. I'm willing to argue the proposition that the pendulum perhaps has swung too far in favor of the legislative branch. In addition to the laws that Father Dreinen pointed out, I think there are probably some other laws that are a residual result of Watergate and the things that happened shortly before and since Watergate. But I think Watergate and its weakening of the executive during that time led to such things as, or the ease of such things as the Budget Reform Act, for example, where Congress reasserted itself in the budgetary process. Some would say we haven't passed a budget since. But regardless of the wisdom of that, I think that there's something to be said for that as a result. Some would say the War Powers Act, certainly the Bolin Amendment, things of that nature. So all of that, although you may not remember much about Watergate in terms of the details, it is having an effect on our system today. Thank you.
Our final panelist tonight had an interesting vantage point, that from the press gallery. Hayes Gory attended the University of Utah, graduating in 1942, and joined the Salt Lake Tribune as the news editor and later city editor. In 1950, he was selected as a Nieman Fellow and came to spend a year at Harvard. He subsequently became an Eisenhower Fellow in Tehran, Iran in 1963, and in 1965 made his way east to join Time magazine in Washington. By 1979, he was appointed as the Boston bureau chief for Time, spent 2 years here, returning as the national political correspondent in Washington. Today, he is the senior correspondent and chief congressional correspondent for Time magazine, one of our nation's finest journalists, Hayes Gory.
Well, I thank you, Roger, and I thank all of you people for being here. It's kind of a reunion for some of us. It's been 15 years or so since we've seen each other. The main point I want to make tonight, and if I make it, I'll go home happy, even if I don't make another point. And that is that secrecy in government does not work, not in the United States. This brings up a current discussion as to whether we should engage in covert activities. I know there are some very strongly held opinions that we not only should, but we have to We must, that the real world requires it. But as I have turned over in my mind the lessons of Watergate and some other major scandals in our government, the most recent of which, the Iran-Contra scandal. And you can go back to John Kennedy's Bay of Pigs, the worst mistake of his presidency. It seems to me that when a government in a democracy, as open as ours is supposed to be, takes upon itself to conduct something in secret, when the only people who know about it are the president and others subservient to him, then we are likely to wander into a swamp from which it will be difficult to extricate ourselves. If, for example, John Kennedy had shared the plan for the Bay of Pigs more widely, we may never have launched that ill thought out venture. On the Iran-Contra affair, that was held so very closely that our president-elect still professes today to not really know much about what was going on, although he was vice president. Had this been presented, this exchange of hostages for weapons, been presented to the Senate Intelligence Committee, I know that committee well, and I have every reason to believe it would have been shot down. We would not have had any Iran-Contra scandal. I think we can say the same about a number of other events in our history, sordid events in our history. John Kennedy did share the Bay of Pigs secret with one member of Congress, and that was Senator J. William Fulbright, who was then chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And Fulbright warned him against doing it. He was the only one. Well, afterwards, a lot of people surfaced to say that they thought it was a terrible idea. And I think that's when John Kennedy said that defeat is an orphan, and victory has 1,000 fathers. When the Watergate break-in first occurred, the first news account of it appeared in the Washington Post on a Sunday morning. The break-in occurred on a Friday evening, too late to make the Saturday papers. I remember reading this account of this ordinary break-in, and I said to my wife, I have to boast a little here because I rarely succeed on some of my predictions, but I said to my wife, this break-in at the Watergate Hotel, Democratic headquarters, is going to lead right to the Oval Office. And she said, oh, that's ridiculous. She said, for one thing, Richard Nixon is too smart to be involved in anything like that. And I said, well, I've covered politics for a good many years, and I happen to know that there isn't anything inside the Democratic National Committee of any value to any ordinary burglar. Some years later, when I tried to boast of this prediction of mine, mentioned it to other people in front of my wife, she couldn't remember. In any event, I think the struggle, and it's an eternal one, between Congress and the executive is reliant in some part on events and in some part on personalities. When we have a strong president, then the power flows to the presidency. When we have a weak president, then Congress asserts itself. And certainly it has asserted itself since Watergate weakened the presidency. Not just Richard Nixon, but it weakened the presidency for some years to come. The effects linger today. Now you can go back to the period when Eisenhower was president, and Congress at that time was Democratic, both houses, as it usually is. And it was led by Lyndon Johnson in the Senate Majority Leader, and Sam Rayburn in the House, Speaker of the House. Both of these men were from Texas. Both of them were ambitious, vigorous, active political leaders, wheeler dealers, and they were able to run roughshod over the Eisenhower White House when they wanted. Now, Eisenhower was a very popular president. I don't think he was a particularly strong one. Ronald Reagan, as all of you in this room know, is an enormously popular president. And usually popularity gives you strength. Certainly it gave Ronald Reagan strength in the early days of his administration. I think if Jimmy Carter had been president when the 247 U.S. Marines were killed in Lebanon, that Carter would have been, if not impeached, he certainly would have been censored and gotten into a lot more difficulty than Ronald Reagan did, simply because of Reagan's overwhelming popularity. So though Reagan and Eisenhower were both very popular presidents, I don't think that necessarily translated into making them strong presidents. So in both those periods, for example, to bring us right up to date, in the 100th Congress, Speaker Jim Wright and Majority Leader Robert Byrd announced at the opening of the Congress just what kind of an agenda they wanted to push. And they pushed it. And I think of the items that they gave priority to, such as a trade bill, a plant closing bill, a highway bill, a clean water bill. I think all of those were enacted into law, several of them over Ronald Reagan's veto. And the only major item on their agenda that did not become law was a Clean Water Act, which we'll probably hear more about. In any event, I think power flows. There is enough what I call wiggle room in our Constitution that a president who with strength can move power towards himself without a major outcry or without violating the Constitution. And on the other hand, when the president is weak, the Congress has enough wiggle room to assert some power for itself. I think we'll continue to go through that. And once again, I would just like to emphasize that I think the American public, the voting public, is very slow to awaken to what is happening to it, what its government is doing. For example, I believe that the country really focused on Watergate when President Nixon fired Archibald Cox as special prosecutor, creating a national firestorm, because everybody could see then, look, you know, what's this prosecutor done? Has he committed moral turpitude? Has he stolen funds out of the office? What has he done? Why should he be fired? He's asking for evidence, and now the president has fired him. I think that was the worst mistake Richard Nixon made. Other people think his keeping the tapes was the worst one, but I think firing Archibald Cox really focused the American mind on what Watergate was all about. I'll close now, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions, but I do want to reiterate the thought I made in the first place. I don't think secrecy works in our government, and I think Watergate is a prime example to prove that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hayes. The panelists have basically asserted that one of the lessons of Watergate is that the system works, that we survived intact, that we got through this period in our history. But we came through it, if I've heard the panelists correctly, with a more assertive Congress, a more open process, and a more skeptical country. Let me pose a question for any observations by some of the panelists, and please feel free to comment on others' observations. Do you think the pendulum has swung too far? Do you think that the reaction to Watergate, the rush of legislation that Father Dreinen so skillfully laid out that has occurred in the wake of Watergate has produced a viable equilibrium between the President and the Congress, or is it in danger of producing gridlock and stalemate?
I'd like to comment. I think in some respects it has. We have the Office of Independent Counsel that Father Dreinen referred to. I suggested the appointment of a special prosecutor 2 days after Watergate occurred, and it took a year before it came about. However, it isn't just the executive branch that can commit abuses of power. I honestly believe that there are enough humanity in the House of Representatives and United States Senate that they too can be guilty of an abuse of power. And it always amazed me that the Congress did not provide a comparable mechanism by which the improprieties of its members couldn't be investigated by an independent counsel. I think also with respect to the scope of the Freedom of Information Act, I don't think that any of us can realize what it is to exist in the executive branch of the government. You come in from a private endeavors to serve your country, the disclosures that you have to make about yourself and your wife and your family and your finances, and then find that you made an innocent mistake, and the next thing you know, you are living in holy terror about the possibility of an indictment by an independent counsel. I think that the fear of this, and it doesn't mean that they have anything to hide, the fear of this, I think, is discouraging some people to come into the government. And I think that the primary area, however, where I think the Congress has gone beyond its legitimate prerogative is the fact that it seeks to investigate the executive branch of the government, but does not provide a mechanism to investigate itself.
I'm not certain that the pendulum has swung too far, and I don't think that the Congress is about to backtrack, because in the 8 years of the Reagan administration, lots of people got into terrible trouble. I don't know whether there was more people indicted or thrown out than in any previous administration, but the Congress looks at that and they say that we have to somehow restore the faith that people should have in the White House, in the executive branch, and that we have to keep the heat on. And I'm inclined to think that there's going to be actually more legislation, or they're going to tighten up the various things. And the Supreme Court, as I mentioned, 7-1, sustained the right of the Congress to put through the Independent Counsel Act, and that hopefully that's going to be used only on rare occasions. We had a long 2-day session of this on this point by the Administrative Conference, and all of the key ball players were there, the man that heads the Office of Integrity, and I think everybody felt, well, it has been good, and that we had Strom Thurmond, frankly, pressing for additional legislation that would tighten up various things. And as you know, the Congress did put through a law after much travail by which they, too, would be caught in the revolving door, and restrictions would be placed upon them and their staff after they leave the Congress. And who beat on it? It's Mr. Reagan. And that I'm sure that's going to come back in some form. And then on the point that should they do more to correct their own people, I think that in fairness to the Congress, they have been very, very careful about that. There's a major investigation going on now about the Speaker, and that during my time there, a large number of people were not merely thrown out of the Congress, but they were indicted and went to jail. And that the Democratic administration of Mr. Civiletti indicted 6 or 7 members of the Congress in a scam, and that lots of them went up to jail. So I'm not certain that it's up to the Congress to investigate. They can't impose a criminal, but frankly, let's shift this to the executive. The executive has to enforce the law, and it's the executive that has the real responsibility to police the Congress. And that they did well. They put more people in jail in the 10 years that I was there than at any previous moment in history.
Pendulum and swung a little far over to the congressional side, and I don't think there's anything to be terribly concerned about. I doubt if there's ever been or ever will be a state of equilibrium, so it's going to be a little bit one way or the other. I think that as far as what's been discussed here, I think when you consider the numbers in the legislative branch and the numbers in the executive branch, the legislative branch probably has a worse track record in terms of members getting in trouble percentage-wise than the executive branch. The question is not, who's the worst. The question is, do we have an institution, do we have a framework to take care of these matters? I tend to think the answer is yes. And as has been pointed out, it's the executive's responsibility to take care of this, whether it be in Congress or it be in the executive branch. If there is an inherent contradiction in the executive branch investigating itself, it was one that was put into the Constitution by the Founding Fathers. And there has never been an example of any significance that I know of where the executive branch, Justice Department, failed to pursue a matter that it was supposed to pursue. In the Carter administration, they vigorously pursued Burt Lance. Harry Truman threw out one of some key Justice Department official for putting the kibosh on a particular investigation. There was not a special prosecutor during Watergate under this act. It preceded the act. Public opinion and political pressure forced President Nixon to establish an individual under those circumstances. Well, I could give other examples. So I think that I'm a little bit more conservative in that we should be cautious in changing the fundamental friction that's inherent in our system. We have a situation now where the special prosecutor, Mr. Walsh, is asserting that there is a criminal violation for a member of the executive branch to conspire to violate essentially the policy of Congress, even though a particular act, law, or written rule is not involved. And as I understand it, even if there has not been a criminal law, act, a written policy involved, if they're in effect going against the will, policy of Congress, in a foreign relations matter, that can be a defrauding of the government under Section 371 of Title 18 of the United States Code. I think that's unprecedented. I think it's unjustified, and I think it's somewhat dangerous. Congress and the executive are supposed to fight with each other. I think the biggest problem that the executive had as far as Iran Contra was concerned is not facing up to it, putting the cards on the table, vetoing the legislation that contained the Bolin Amendment, and fight it out in court, instead of trying to circumvent, not necessarily illegally, but circumventing, as FDR apparently circumvented the Neutrality Act to help out the British in World War II. It's dangerous. It's not the way to go. They should put their cards on the table and fight it on the merits. But I feel the pendulum has swung a bit too far on the legislative side. But as I say, it's going to be somewhere in a non-state of equilibrium all the time.
Of course, Oliver North and John Poindexter are accused of a lot more than violation of the Bolin Amendment. There are some 16 charges originally against North. I think some of them have been set aside, but there's still a number of charges, including appropriating to himself the right to determine how United States funds are spent. There's a dispute over whether those are United States funds, I know. But
that's not really a separation of powers issue, I think.
Well, no, but I felt that you were confining the indictment to the Bolin Amendment.
No, just the separation of powers issue that the Justice Department has addressed recently.
I'd just like to say one thing about the press, but before then, in my years in Washington, it seems to me that we've had the most effective periods of government. They've been short, unfortunately. When the Congress and the President decided to cooperate, to get along with each other. Now, Jimmy Carter came to Washington without any Washington experience, and so did Ronald Reagan. And Carter thought that he could turn the government around, that people were fed up with the Watergate and its dishonesty and so on. And whatever else anybody could say about Jimmy Carter, he was an honest man. In his own light, and I think in the light of most people. He found that it wasn't like turning a rowboat around in the middle of the Charles River. To turn this government around is like trying to turn an aircraft carrier around at sea. It takes a long time and a lot of work and a lot of understanding. I don't think Jimmy Carter realized that soon enough. Now, Ronald Reagan, in my opinion, has nothing but contempt for Congress. And I think he has shown it through the years. He never served in Congress, which doesn't prohibit him from becoming president, obviously. As a matter of fact, that doesn't assure that he would even not be more contemptuous of Congress had he served in it. But the truth of the matter is that for 7.5 years, the congressional leadership, including Republicans as well as Democrats, tried to get Ronald Reagan to sit down and tackle this budget deficit problem. And at the end, I should say 6.5 years, at nearly the end of his 7th year in office, he finally agreed to what has become known as an economic summit. As I say, I think if Congress and the President will work together, and for brief periods they do, we'd have a better government. I also want to just make one comment with regard to the press and its coverage of Watergate. I think that was the press's finest hour. And it wasn't as easy as I think some of the comments made here tonight would seem to indicate. For example, there was always the threat of libel. Dick Kleindienst's predecessor as Attorney General, John Mitchell, I can recall one memorable phrase, Dick, that appeared in the Washington Post when Woodward and Bernstein got Mitchell at his apartment in New York and told him about some story they were going to run. And Mitchell warned them to tell Kay Graham, publisher of the Post, they better not use that story or she would, I can't repeat the phrase, but she would get something of her anatomy caught in a wringer. So it wasn't all that easy. There were many people who denied truth, and it was very difficult sometimes to establish it. You have to get more than one source usually, or it would have to be one very, very good source. So in any event, I think that whereas the presidency declined in the aftermath of Watergate, the press power grew, and maybe too much. Of course, with television being as pervasive as it is, we have to live with the fact that we have a press which is perhaps too powerful. And I think many members of the profession realize that and don't really know what to do about it. For example, I think a lot of us feel that we drove Gary Hart out of the presidential race before the public had a chance to do so. Well, Hart came back and and gave the public a second chance, and they did it. So, but in any event, we were feeling a little bit uneasy for a while.
Now, one last thing on this thing that 3 or 4 people here have said that they feel that the Congress has gone too far. Well, I'm asking for specifics. Like how far? What do you mean too far? They're too zealous in cleaning up the executive? Does the people keep people out of government? What are we saying? And that the mood of Congress is still very, very suspicious of the executive branch, and that I reviewed parts of this impeachment document from the House Judiciary Committee. And this documents everything that happened. And I had forgotten some of these things. It's terrible. All of the disasters that happened because of secrecy and because of conniving. So that the Congress is going to, it seems to me, continue unless the case against this legislation has to be is documented. So I'm just asking for specifics. What do you mean gone too far? The pendulum has swung too far. Like how?
Jim Wright wants to be the Secretary of State as well as the Speaker of the House. And I think that that's one area
No, but that's irrelevant to this discussion.
Then you say, how's the Congress gone too far? I think they're taking upon themselves, because of the aftermath of Watergate, a lot of areas that I think under the Constitution were specifically and understandably reserved to the executive branch of the government. And I think foreign policy is one of them. Maybe that's
well, I teach constitutional law, and that you can debate that. And that I had trouble with the War Powers Resolution. However, that's not directly related to the impeachment. That's related to Vietnam. How does this undeclared war go on for all of these years? And that lots of people had trouble with the War Powers Resolution, and it's clouded now because of the charter decision. But I would ask you, sir, in this area, in the area of government regulation, congressional legislation that makes the executive branch open and accountable. That's clearly within the Constitution, and that the Congress has to do all types of oversight, and the Congress, frankly, felt terribly aggrieved that they didn't even know about these dreadful things that were happening and the subversion of justice, and when it came out, they reacted, and they're still reacting.
and they're looking at these laws, and that now people are saying, well, this pendulum swung too far. Give me specifics is all I'm asking.
I don't think anyone is saying that violations of the criminal laws in the executive branch should not be prosecuted. I think that what we're talking about is specific instances where there are questions concerning the legislative branch involving itself in areas that traditionally have not been involved in. Many of them have not been tested before the Supreme Court yet. I think there are two things that you can say that are given factors that will always be with us. One is that the pendulum will swing back and forth, and number two, how we look at the pendulum at any given time depends on whose ox is being gored. Now, if we had, and we will have one of these days, a different administration, different policies, maybe totally different policies, and we'll have these same laws, these same special prosecutors or independent counsels now operating under the same laws, and I wonder if present company excluded, but I wonder if all of the people now who are so vigorous in seeing that every wrongdoing of the executive is ferreted out, and Congress, whose ethics committees have traditionally been a bit docile, I think, to say the least, and in policing itself, I wonder if those same people will be that interested in seeing that when their policies, the political policies that they are for, are being carried out, they'll have the same vigor and interest in seeing a special prosecutor being set up, going before the courts and arguing that those executive members should be indicted, prosecuted, and convicted for violation policies of Congress, not a criminal law, but policies of Congress. I doubt it.
To stand by idly when the executive is doing something of questionable legality. For example, Michael Dukakis, before he fell silent on almost every subject, I think had a point when he said what we were doing in Nicaragua is illegal. I mean, you can be for it, for the Contras or opposed to the Contras, and that doesn't really matter. Is the United States, under law, under the Constitution, allowed to intervene in behalf of an insurrection in a country with an elected government and a government with which the United States maintains relations? I'm not a lawyer. We've got some excellent lawyers here on the panel, so I'm not going to carry that until I get over my head, which I may be already. But it seems to me that's a legal point worth arguing. And I think Congress is obliged to argue those points when such things happen.
Well, wait a minute, Hayes. I believe that Congress appropriated funds to the executive branch of the government to aid the Contras, and then there was an argument in the Congress, and they changed that for just humanitarian aid. A nice question would be the applicability of the Poland Amendment to persons on the national security staff, and I think that's a constitutional argument. But I don't think that this administration, forget about dealing with monies for the sale of these weapons, that's a side issue. I do not think that this administration violated the law with respect to its general Contra policies. That was a matter of political debate in the political marketplace.
Provide plenty of opportunity for those of you in the audience to ask questions. We would remind you that this is not your forum, but the forum for the panelists, and so we would encourage you to put your questions in the form of a question rather than a speech, and certainly have it last no longer than 1 minute. There are mics which have been provided which you can go to if you have a question to ask, and we'll begin with the gentleman here on my right.
I wonder, I'm a journalist who's covered Watergate for Dow Jones at the time it occurred. I wonder if each of the panelists could give me their own answer to two questions. One is, what were the intruders after when they broke into Watergate? And second, who was Deep Throat, the source of the Washington Post stories?
I know the answer to both those questions.
the conventional wisdom is that President Nixon's brother Don, together with Larry O'Brien, worked for Howard Hughes. And President Nixon's brother Don had some difficulties. And the conventional wisdom is that President Nixon, incidentally, there's no evidence that President Nixon knew about the break-in. However, there's a strong inference that he could have mused at 5 o'clock in the afternoon in the Oval Office with his feet up on the desk with somebody like Chuck Colson out loud and said, I just wonder what Larry O'Brien knows about my brother, Don Nixon. Well, with the mentality of that Watergate White House crowd, that's all they'd have to hear. Just what do you want to know? And it could be set in movement. And I think that's how that came about, quite frankly. With respect to Deep Throat, I don't believe that there was a deep throat. I think it was a clever literary illusion created by two very gifted writers, because to be Deep Throat, you would have to have been about three different kind of people in terms of the information that you had, how you got it, and your ability to give it to somebody else. And I really believe that the conventional wisdom has come down that there is no deep throat. Probably a composite of two or three people, and it was, I think, one of the most brilliant literary illusions that gifted writers have come up with in a long time.
I agree. Deep Throat is a composite, I'm almost certain, and I have been told that by the woman who edited the book. And as a matter of fact, I believe Deep Throat was her creation, not Woodward and Bernstein. That dramatized it, made a better book, made a better movie.
Thank you. The panelists have seemed to be fairly optimistic about the aftermath of Watergate, trying to find out the lessons that we might have learned and try to discuss the laws that have been beneficial that have come out of it. And today we are about to embark, or maybe about to embark, on the trials of some people involved in the Iran-Contra affair, which has been, of course, compared to Watergate. In fact, Senator Inouye mentioned that he felt that the Iran-Contra affair was much more serious than Watergate. And in light of those remarks, I was wondering if you could comment on what you think we ought to do in response to the Iran-Contra affair, as certain things were done in response to Watergate 15 years ago in terms of laws and policy changes. I wonder if you could respond to that.
What more do you want to be done? There was a Senate and House investigation. There was the appointment of an independent counsel. There have been indictments handed down. Do you want to hang them up by their thumbs or put spears in their eyes? You're using the full process of the law with respect to the violation of any law after a complete investigation. I don't know what else you would want to have done.
There is one other thing pending, and we may have lost it in the last Congress, but I think we'll hear about it again. And that is a requirement that any covert action must be reported to the Senate and House Intelligence Committees within 48 hours. Iran-Contra, you see, was not reported for 10 months.
One other thing that could be done is investigate and reanalyze the National Security Council. This has caused a lot of trouble. It's a runaway organization. The head of it is not subject to Senate confirmation. And I think that restructure it and maybe even abolish it or bring it back to what the original intention was. This is only supposed to supply good information to the President, but the Secretary of State and also the Secretary of Defense should decide it, and the National Security Council should not be making those decisions.
The lady on my right.
This question is for Mr. Gory. Having stating that the secrecy in government doesn't work, I wonder if there's a greater likelihood it will occur during the next presidency, since President-elect Bush is a former director of the CIA and, as stated in today's New York Times, plans on strengthening the relationship between the president and the CIA.
Well, I think a lot of people were, well, not enough, because Bush was elected, but there were concerns about his having been a former director of Central Intelligence and then becoming president. And he has said in recent days, in fact, that he is in favor of covert operations. I do think it would be helpful if this law that I mentioned is passed in the Congress and signed by the President, which would cut down the amount of time which could elapse before the Congress is informed. I think that would be helpful. But I think Bush has made it quite clear that he intends to continue with covert activities unless and until Congress should prohibit them.
Well, I hope he does intend to continue.
I thought you'd hope that.
Gentleman on my left.
Thanks for your historical review, because some of us of the tender years don't have that good a memory of Watergate. My memory was seeing the evening news and just a picture of the White House. I couldn't figure out where all the water was kept. But anyway, my question is about Mr. Gory's principle and lesson that secrecy doesn't work in government. And I think that's a pretty optimistic message to take from Watergate. I'd like to believe that. But I see two problems coming from it. One is with the press, and that the extension of power to the press. And your example was good about driving Gary Hart out of the election, which I think the press did. Before the public would have driven him out. And problems like that, too much invasion of privacy of political candidates, for not real good reasons, or maybe for good reasons, but just going too far. Marvin Kalb said that the press has to regulate itself. It can't be regulated by other people. I wonder if you could comment on that problem. The second problem is the other side of that, and that's the growing strength of the executive power as perhaps a result of Watergate, in that a lot of operations have just gone further undercover. And there's evidence that there have been more black directives or national directives by Ronald Reagan in foreign policy and in domestic policy than any other president. There's also been evidence that there's been massive surveillance of minorities by the FBI and the INS under President Reagan. There was a case in Los Angeles that exposed just widespread INS and FBI abuse and surveillance of Palestinian Americans who were long citizens and standing members of the community. My question is, the problem there would be an overextension of the executive branch's privilege and use of the FBI, the CIA, and the INS. And I see these problems as going in different directions. The way to correct executive abuse is a stronger press, and the way to stop a stronger press is to have more energetic government. So I was wondering if you could comment on either way, the overextension of the press and the too much secrecy on the part of the executive.
Well, I have made the same speech that I think you must have heard Marvin Kalb deliver, which is that the press must do something to control itself. Because if we're going to stick with the First Amendment, and I assume we are, and I hope we are, then the press has got to do it. I don't think it's necessary when a whisper of an accusation about a public official circulates in Washington that we have to have 8 camera crews on the man's lawn the following morning. And I think there are things the press could do, such as, for example, we do with a pool. When we go on Air Force One, there's just a small pool of reporters, and another plane brings 300 or 500 more, and along with cameras. So I would agree. I think the public expects us to do something about the abuses, which are quite apparent. As far as executive power and using the powers of the FBI, Dick Kleindienst can tell you when he was an attorney general and deputy, there were a lot of accusations about surveillances, some of which turned out to be true. Street rioters and anti-war protesters, photographs of them taken, their names registered, they were put under surveillance. And I know the case you're talking about more recently, which is really quite shocking in view of what has gone on before and what we all thought had been condemned. I don't know. I think the new FBI director and the new attorney general are simply going to have to be extremely vigilant over this type of activity, or we won't stamp it out.
I agree with that, Hayes. One of the interesting things that occurred in the electronic surveillance field was eventually a law by the Congress that would require a court-ordered warrant, if you wish, under the Fourth Amendment before the Attorney General could institute an electronic surveillance, even for national security reasons. One of the big problems that got the people up in the White House in trouble was that they used the excuse of national security to be running off insinuating wiretaps on people with respect to which there shouldn't have been a national security interest. With respect to the surveillance, the question you raised on minority groups, that has never been a policy of the Department of Justice or the FBI itself. When you have a field force of some 15,000 FBI agents, I think sometimes some of them can, on their own, be a little bit overactive and do things which, when reported to the proper sources in the FBI or the Department of Justice, are condemned and immediately corrected. I think the state of our health, generally speaking, with respect to covert action and electronic conveyance, and it took 50 years for us to get from the old Olmsted case up to the legislation now, so that we truly have Fourth Amendment warrant protection before the United States government can insinuate an electronic surveillance, either for organized crime or for national security purposes.
Thank you.
One last point, that for 10 years I was on the relevant subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee on surveillance by the FBI, and after much negotiation we did have them knock off COINTELPRO. They had 22,000 Americans under surveillance, and that was brought down to 400. But despite the rules that were developed, Mr. Sessions has admitted this, that they did surveillance on CISPES, and contrary to what Mr. Kleindienst just said, no FBI agent has ever, at any moment, ever been punished for doing surveillance without authorization.
The gentleman on my right.
Yes, since the Watergate scandal, American people have been more critical of the president. How do you feel this has affected his role in defining the nation, and what has been the role of Congress?
Would you repeat the question, please?
Yes, since the Watergate scandal, the American people have been more critical of the president. And how do you feel this has affected his role in defining the nation? What has been the role of Congress? Do you think Congress has taken the forefront and the president has been asked to step to the back door? Do you think people are looking more towards Congress for legislation than the president?
Well, it seems to me that the Congress is so diverse. I mean, you've got 535 individuals and relative degrees or lack of cohesion. The president, we in the press are given hell frequently for not being tough enough on Ronald Reagan. And I don't think the American people have been all that tough on him. He certainly is leaving office with the highest favorability rating of any two-term president, I guess, within memory. And although the Watergate certainly brought a lot of criticism of Nixon, I think Ford and Carter, who followed him, just enjoyed the usual amount. And there will always be a certain amount, and should be.
I wonder if the members of the panel could comment on President Ford's decision to pardon President Nixon. And I'd be particularly interested in your view on that issue when it happened and your view now, 15 years later.
I think President Ford should have pardoned former President Nixon sooner than he did. You can't understand the effect of Watergate and those hearings on our country. The government of the United States stopped. We couldn't get programs going in the Department of Justice. I just can't believe, in terms of the necessity of having the public of the United States exposed to a criminal trial of Richard Milhouse Nixon, sitting on a witness stand with sweat coming down his nose and 3 steel balls in his hand, day after day. The torment, the torture, the interruption of the trauma upon our government would have been absolutely unnecessary. He was impeached, he was gone, and I think for the benefit of the country, I'm glad that President Ford pardoned him. I know President Ford well enough to know that he had no prior understanding with Nixon that he would be pardoned if he resigned. I think he did the right thing. If I were he, I'd have just done it a little bit sooner than he did.
reaction was very negative throughout the country. And as you may know, in the Constitution itself, it is specifically provided that for an impeached individual, like an impeached president, he may never get a pardon. So the Founding Fathers intended that they never should be pardoned. So there's the lesson there. And it seems to me that Mr. Ford, whom I admire, probably lost the election over that decision. And that I don't think the decision was necessary, and I think that even the president is accountable, that he is under God and the law, as St. Thomas More said. So that I think that history would have recorded that he wouldn't have been impeached, but that why wasn't Richard Nixon, like all of the others, why was not he required to come and tell the people what had been done?
He was never required to do that. He wasn't even required to sign a statement of mission of anything. But it seems to me that Ronald Reagan, in discussing the North Poindexter case, has said that the process should be allowed to work. That if a person is granted a pardon, that means he has committed a crime for which he needs to be pardoned, and for which he has been. And then he carries through his whole life the burden of having been pardoned for committing a crime. So I think, without question, that there was a lot of disruption in the country. But when I first heard that on a Sunday morning, as I was driving from my daughter's class reunion or something at Brown University, and turned on the car radio and heard that Gerald Ford had pardoned Richard Nixon, I was just dumbfounded, and I remain so.
That question to me was and has been the toughest for me to resolve myself of anything that has come out of it. I still haven't really come to terms with it. I think it's important that, again, that in making a decision like that, as much as we can, or coming to our own conclusions, that we as supposedly educated people, hopefully leaders of society and so forth, can come to these conclusions based on something other than the personalities involved at the time, considering the institutions and what's best for the nation. I spent a long time, at least those in the White House at the time thought I was on the prosecution side. I was the one who questioned Butterfield about the tapes in public session. And I had a little bit of problem with the circumventing of the process. Let's carry it on out. But I think it might have been something like kind of the hounds and the fox kind of syndrome. I think that most of us got caught up in the anti-Nixon sentiment and feeling that was going on at that time, and it was tremendous. I must say, as more time passes by, and looking back on it, I agree with my friend, fellow Nashville lawyer Jim Neal, who prosecuted all those people, when he says it was probably the best thing to do, all considered. The pardon provision is in the Constitution. It is one of those powers that are given to the president. It is one of those very sober things the president has to decide for his own good reason, and I'm sure Gerald Ford didn't do it thinking that it was going to help him politically, but he did it because he thought it was a good thing for the country at the time. I doubt seriously if Dick Nixon, if he had been prosecuted, would have taken the witness stand and said, "You got me, I'm going to tell you just how it is now." I don't think we'd learned anything from it. So I think on balance it was probably the right thing to do.
I'd like to ask the panelists about people the generation of people who've come of age since Watergate, and whether or not they think that because of the enormity of the scandal, that many young people have been discouraged, whether as voters or as candidates, to consider politics a noble profession. And in light of the subsequent scandals of Abscam and Iran-Contra, how do you respond to people who feel that corruption in government isn't necessarily an aberration, and that these three instances are just cases of people who happen to get caught?
All they have to do is get involved in politics and do something about it. And if you don't get involved, and if you don't do something about it, you can't sit by and just ask a lot of questions and bitch about it because it didn't work out the way you wanted to. Every young person in this country ought to be a politician. Put together a political government for you. You ought to get involved in it. You ought to raise money for candidates. You ought to elect candidates. And you ought to run for office yourself, and then come back 20 years later and see how you stand up when they ask you questions about how you did. That's how I feel about what you ought to do.
I echo Mr. Kleindienst completely. They get involved in politics.
I agree for
Oh, yeah. But I'm afraid, sir, that the memory is very short, and every 5 years we get a new generation coming along. Let me tell you a little story that actually happened the other day. In the corridor at Georgetown Law School, this fine young woman came up, and she said, "Oh, I'm so excited. I'm going to Boston tomorrow for a job interview at Hale & Dorr." And I said, "Oh, perhaps you'll meet Mr. Jim St. Clair." And she said, "Who's he?" In case you don't know, he was the counsel for the President of the United States. So I told her, and she said, "I was 12. So I think I'm glad that you remember these things, but that the generation coming along, I'm afraid, needs to be reminded.
I don't think there's any evidence, I've never seen any, that's convincing that people have stayed out of government because of these scandals. We've got 230 million people in this country, and every once in a while you'll hear a senator or a congressman say, politics is too much for me, I'm getting out. Well, fine, let him go. It isn't for everybody. But I don't think there's ever a shortage of candidates for a desirable political office, nor for a desirable appointed political job. And I don't think there will be. If you are so afraid of having your privacy invaded, then you don't belong in public life. And there are people who are unwilling to have their privacy invaded, and that's fine. Let them conduct the law firms and become doctors and journalists, do whatever they want. They're not obliged to go into public life.
One final question, the gentleman on my left.
I wondered if all members of the panel think that Watergate demonstrated that the system does work. I wondered if it didn't demonstrate that, might not have demonstrated that the system does not work. Don't we now have a Congress which is able and willing to remove a popularly elected president, essentially negating the will of the electorate for a president who opposes them? In other words, the president really has to kowtow to Congress. Several members of the panel mentioned that the Congress now has new powers to supervise the president, and they have the power to remove him, but Congress people get elected, I guess, 98.5% of the time, which suggests that they aren't even supervised by their own voters, perhaps. Is this the way the system is supposed to work?
Well, I would say that I think the system did work in Watergate. I think we reached a conclusion, maybe not a perfect one, but certainly a satisfactory one. You're mentioning that the people elect the president, and yet Congress has the right to remove him. But Congress would never remove a president unless there was popular sentiment asking for that.
Why do you say that?
Well, because when Richard Nixon was elected or reelected...
Excuse me, could I just point out that Congress has nothing to fear? In other words, if Congress were really, if only 50% of congressmen got reelected, then they would have to worry that if they did something unpopular, they would not get reelected. But if their reelection is virtually guaranteed, they can do something that is not, that is contrary to the popular will.
No, not anything that public, that blaring. Richard Nixon, when he was impeached or on the verge of being impeached, was not the Richard Nixon that people voted for in 1972. It was an entirely different individual.
In what way?
He had become involved in the cover-up and a conspiracy, in criminality, income tax violations, all sorts of acts which certainly didn't sit well with the public as well as with Congress. It wasn't the same man. Congress could never have impeached Richard Nixon on November 10th of 1972 because all of this came out later.
You don't think that any president who is unpopular with Congress could not be found to have the same kind of flaws?
No.
Okay.
I think that Nixon lost all of his credibility, regardless of the merits. He lost all of his credibility. You could conclude, or you could you could argue the proposition that it's much tougher to impeach a president than we thought before the Nixon enterprise, and not easier to do it. I mean, you can go through a litany of the things that we went through, the debates that we went through at the time, and how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. And I mean, it was a real strained, torturous exercise, and it took, in my estimation, a hell of a lot to get as close as they did. And these congressmen are no fools, and they do get elected. I think through gerrymandering and through the campaign financing system we've got now, 99% are going to continue to get elected almost anything that, regardless of anything they do. But if they take on a popular president, or if they try to throw out of office or impeach a president that is not totally lost the faith of the American people, the public, I think, will turn on them. I've never seen, I don't think it's happened historically. Even Andrew Johnson wouldn't be a case of that, I don't think.
No one tried to impeach Ronald Reagan at the height of the Iran-Contra scandal.
I don't think the press would dare try it
sir.
again after they had made such a careful campaign to publicize, and they made a deal with Congress, I'm sure you're aware, to televise live all of the hearings in order to build up the case against Nixon to make it possible to make him look impeachable.
Father Dreinen.
That's entirely wrong, but I don't know whether we have time to debate it.
I think that the impeachment inquiry was successful, but I think we should note very soberly that in my judgment, they might have impeached him maybe for the right reasons, but not for the important reasons. I was the person who happened to file the first resolution of impeachment against Richard Nixon, not over Watergate, but over the clandestine bombing of Cambodia. Without the knowledge or consent of the Congress, he sent 3,800 sorties over a neutral country. I mean, totally in violation of international law, and unbeknownst to anybody, as I say. And when this came out, I and some others filed a resolution of impeachment, and that in the House Judiciary Committee, we made as much inquiry of this as we could, but frankly, there was no bipartisan support, and we received only 12 votes of the necessary 21 to impeach him because of this violation of his office as a high crime and misdemeanor. So I think we should be very sober and say, well, yes, the system worked in a sense, but that maybe history will record that the House Judiciary Committee did not do what they should have done, in my judgment, namely impeach him because of what he did in Cambodia.
Note he got elected in '72 after your effort to impeach him.
Excuse me, sir, you'll have to sit down. The witching hour has come. We can see that Watergate, even though it happened 15 years ago, is still a lively topic. On behalf of all of us, I would like to thank our 4 outstanding panelists for providing us with a truly stimulating evening. Thank you.